Hi, everybody. Welcome back to the Brewery Underground podcast. I'm Steve Sullivan, and I am joined today by the Chancellor of Craft Beer, Scott Turon. And Scott, this is actually our very first podcast that we've done together. I'm usually looking at you through a computer screen when we do it, but we are on the road today.
We're on the road, and we are live and in person. Well, we're not live necessarily. We're live right now. This will not air live, but we're sitting in the beautiful Blackstone Brewing facility here, and we're sitting with Mr. Scott Mertie, who owns Nashville Brewing Company.
Good morning. Nice to be here with you guys.
Good morning. And we do want to mention that we're actually doing this. This is not going to drop on St. Patrick's Day. It'll drop a little bit after that. But we are recording today on St. Patrick's Day. I've got a green shirt on, some green beads. Scott didn't have a green shirt, but I got him some green beads. And you're wearing a Guinness shirt.
I got my Guinness shirt.
Yeah.
Everyone thinks of me as a lager guy, but every once in a while, I'll bend to the ales.
All right. Good deal. Hey, and you know what? We always begin a podcast. We're drinking a beer. And cheers, boys.
Cheers.
Yep. And tell us what we are drinking today.
We are actually drinking the Nashville Light, which is our newest release of our lagers. Under the Nashville Brewing brand, we do 100% lager beers, as the original Nashville Brewery did in the late 1800s. And Nashville Light really was kind of a happy accident. We got pushed, I shouldn't say pushed, but encouraged to do a light beer by our distributors because some of the issues that happened with Bud Light and sales being down, they wanted to try and supplement some of those sales, as it's the same distributor that distributes Anheuser-Busch products. And so they were encouraging us last late summer, early fall to do a light beer. And so we were kind of reluctant at first, but then finally agreed and did a lot of research and testing to get this light beer out. And when we did, it became very well received. And right at that same time was the Great American Beer Festival, which is the largest Brewers Association sanctioned competition in the United States. And so we submitted it and it ended up winning gold. So we are drinking the nation's #1 light beer right now.
I like what I have so far. All right.
It's really good. And I would say I typically don't go to light beers, but I've had this before, and it is really good. It's definitely worthy of a gold medal.
Well, thank you. And I generally don't drink this beer either. I tend to go more towards our Nashville Lager, which is the Bavarian Helles, more of our classic flagship beer. But yeah, this is good to have every once in a while too.
It's good at, especially at 10:45 in the morning on a Sunday.
Exactly.
Probably a good one to start with.
It's either you start with a light beer or you start with a breakfast beer. We've joked about that on the podcast before. Like, hey, what are the great breakfast beers out there that you can start with in the morning?
Well, he mentioned one earlier. He's got an oatmeal stout on.
Yeah, we do have an oatmeal stout.
All right.
And
all right.
that very well could be next.
Scott, there is so much history that we need to talk about. And it's always like one of them things where you go, maybe we should just start from the beginning, because the Nashville Brewery has been operating off and on since 1859.
That's correct.
And you are now the owner. You've been owner for quite some time, a number of years now, right?
Yeah, so we relaunched it in 2016.
Yep.
So we're in our 8th year now.
Yeah. Now, as a guy who grew up with a passion for beer, and now you're the owner, did you ever think as a kid that this was going to happen to you?
I really didn't. I collected beer cans as a kid, so I was always exposed in beer and different brands and styles. But as far as owning a brewery, that never even crossed my mind, because back then there weren't craft breweries. They didn't exist. I'm a little bit older than you guys, I think. So they just weren't around. So you had the big Anheuser-Busch's, Miller's, Coors, and so I never dreamt of owning something like that. By any means, but once the craft brewery industry started, or microbreweries as they were originally called, started to come about, I started to see that as a dream at some point, and glad to partner with my friends at Blackstone to make that happen.
Absolutely. And Blackstone, I've mentioned on the podcast too, I've been here for 25 years. When I came here in 1998, there were only a couple of breweries that you could get craft beer from, and Blackstone was one of them.
Yeah, we called them the 4 Bs. So the first microbrewery in the state was Bohannon Brewing Company. They also marketed it as Market Street. They were down 2nd Avenue, which was called Market Street back in the day. So they were the first one in the state. And then a few years later, Blackstone opened in 1994. And then we had Big River and Bosco's. So they all had the B, and they were the 4 Bs. And so they operated that way for about 10 years until Yazoo put that Y in there. But outside of that, we had the 4 Bs, and then shortly after that, Bohannon closed. So we still had the 4 breweries, but Yazoo essentially replaced Bohannon, Market Street.
So I'm a really big history buff, and I'm going to try not to take up all of the conversation today from Mr. Turon sitting next to me.
Go right ahead, man. You nerd out.
I'm going to nerd out on history because I love history. I am really curious about how much you know as far as like the Nashville Brewery that opened in 1859. I mean, that is, you think about that, and I go, what did things look like back then? And I actually had looked up, this is nerding out, on Wikipedia, whether they're accurate or not, but they had the U.S. Census numbers from 1860 that showed Nashville is the 54th largest city in the U.S. at that time, with a population of about 16,000. And I go, so back in the day when the brewery opened in 1859, how were people getting to the brewery? They could only walk or get there by
horse and
buggy.
Back then, breweries, they really weren't a destination spot. I mean, they were making beer to put in the saloons. So you would go to the saloon and, for the most part, get draft beer. Although Nashville Brewing Company did start packaging beer too. They were the first brewery in Nashville to package. There were, prior to NBC, there were some breweries in Nashville. The first one was the Nashville Porter and Ale Brewery that opened up in the early 1800s. Operated for just a few years, very small mom and pop shop, ironically just a few blocks from where we're sitting right now. That was a big tract of land that's now part of Centennial Park, but there's a spring in Centennial Park that they recently rediscovered right by West End Avenue. That spring ran all the way down right by where we're sitting, basically down Charlotte and through Germantown, and ended up dumping into the Cumberland River. That's now been all covered up. But at the time, the brewery was sitting there at a base, and it had a water wheel, that was doing the grist, churning that. And so that was that first brewery. But again, it didn't last very long. So we had several other ale breweries in the early to mid 1800s, and all throughout the United States, all breweries were ale. That was ale's the old style of beer. Lager was the new style of beer. Lager is only about 500 years old, but no one knew what the heck lager was if you weren't in Bavaria, because beer just wasn't being transported throughout. And it wasn't until the mid 1800s we had this mass German immigration to the United States, and we had a lot of Germans going to the German towns that we think of today, like Cincinnati. I know you're from Cincinnati.
Yeah.
Milwaukee, St. Louis. So we had a lot of those traditional German breweries that we think of that have popped up there. But Germans were settling in other cities too. We certainly had our fair share that came to Nashville, and that became Germantown, as we know it. A lot of them settled just north of downtown, and so we had several breweries there that kind of popped up. Again, these were just brewing out of the house basically, and selling growlers and stuff like that just to the local neighborhood. And it wasn't until Jacob Stiefel, who was a German immigrant, got the idea of let's build a bigger production brewery. And these Germans brought their lager style method of brewing with them, which was new to America. And so Jacob Stiefel built this brewery just south of downtown, so the opposite side of Germantown. He had more room to build because he built this brewery from the ground up, and it was built as a production brewery. And so in 1859 he built that, and he had dug out lager cellars, and so that's where they were aging the beer. And German lager just means to store beer. And so they were doing that because we didn't have refrigeration back then and had to keep it cool, particularly to ferment lagers that are cooler temperatures than ales. And so I started in 1850. Unfortunately, our nation had a big hiccup right after that, and that was the Civil War.
Yeah.
So that halted production for a while. Although you being a history buff, you may know that Nashville was known as kind of a hot spot for the brothels in the Civil War, particularly right down on 2nd Avenue. Once the North kind of took over Nashville, they were hanging out. We had the Nashville Brewing Companies right at the foothills of Fort Negley there. But all these brothels, I don't have evidence showing that Stiefel was brewing beer during the Civil War, just because they probably weren't keeping documentation. But the soldiers were being fed beer or drinking beer while visiting all the brothels that Nashville was really known for during the Civil War. But it wasn't until 1864 that documentation showed he started officially brewing again and selling to the public.
And you look at those days too. I mean, how they even got supplies around. I mean, it wasn't like they could just call up your local store. We'll talk about this at some point. There, farmers that grow grain specifically for brewing.
Yeah.
He had to get it from other places.
Yeah, and so back then, Tennessee was actually pretty big in growing barley. There was a pretty large barley farming industry in Middle Tennessee, outside of the city. We don't have that now. We got a few boutique grain companies that do make local grain. Some of the breweries use those now. Some of the craft breweries in town use that. But back then they were getting most of the grain locally.
Do you know when they first opened, like how many beers were actually made available, like what the styles were? You said mainly lagers and stuff.
Yeah,
right?
yeah. So they were only doing lagers. They were doing a brown ale. I'm sorry, not ale. A brown lager at that time. Really, contrary to popular belief, everyone thinks that a lager is a light-colored beer, but lagers can be dark. They can be hoppy. Just like ales can have a variety. Lagers has that same variety. And since lagers came about, lagers were a brown to dark beer up until the mid to late 1800s, when they figured out how to have a different malting process. And that was using a kiln rather than, used to be malt was dried out using open flame fire, and the smoke would go through as the beer would be smoky. You had no way to control the colors and the caramelization of the malt. So the beer would be dark. And, really England first invented that method in the late 1700s, early 1800s with pale ale. And then the Germans kind of stole that method, or borrowed it, I should say. But technically, it was the owner of Spaten Brewery. He sent his son over to England to be an apprentice, but really learn how to do that light colored beer. And so they started out doing an amber beer. Then it wasn't until 1842 when Pilsner Urquell came out with that Pilsner style, which was really that first light lager. And so into the 1850s, 1860s. But here in the United States, as brewing was first coming about, they didn't have access to that kilning method until really like the 1890s is when the pale lagers started coming about, the Pilsner style beer.
I'm curious if you happen to know when the brewery first opened, how much beer was. How much was it for?
From a volume standpoint?
Was it a pint of beer or?
Yeah, I mean, they were roughly, they were doing kegs. And then when they were bottling beer, they had little 8-ounce bottles, and then bigger, almost like a quart bottle, is what they were doing back then.
So when you bought Nashville Brewing Company, and I'd be curious about
and
this.
it wasn't I bought it. I started.
You started,
Had the trademark. No one had the trademark since 1890, essentially.
Okay.
And so relaunched it.
Relaunched it. Do you develop your own recipes based on kind of some old recipes
Yes,
from back in those days? Okay.
In fact, I did a lot of research and have quite a few original recipes. It just to kind of back up just a little bit. So Nashville Brewing Company was purchased in 1890 by Christian Moerlein, another Cincinnati type.
Yep.
Mm-hmm.
And after the Civil War, the South kind of became an economic market for the northern companies they were investing. And one of those was in brewing, but refrigeration came about right in the 1888 in the brewing industry. And so that enabled some of the northern breweries to see the South as a bigger market because of the hotter temperatures, refrigeration, able to do some better quality beer. So Christian Moerlein was one of the biggest brewers in the country at that point. He bought Nashville Brewing Company in 1890 and sent his head brewer down to run it. And his head brewer was named William Gerst, which a lot of people that have been in Nashville for a while are familiar with that Gerst name. So Gerst was running the brewery and it was operating called Moerlein Gerst Brewing Company, doing business as the Nashville Brewing Company. So they were the owners, still running the Nashville Brewing Company until 1893, when Christian Moerlein essentially retired from the brewing business, sold the Nashville interest to William Gerst outright, and he changed the name to the William Gerst Brewing Company. At that point, he was no longer brewing as the Nashville Brewing Company. It just became William Gerst Brewing Company. But back to your question, so I've got original recipes documented from what Gerst was using, and some of that ties back, and then we've got formulations, ingredients, and things that we know that Nashville Brewing Company was even using decades earlier than that. So we formulated our recipes. Our first beer, our flagship lager, is just called generically Nashville Lager, but the style is a Bavarian Helles style. Okay. And so that we use 100% German ingredients when we make that beer. We import all of our malt, our malted barley, and we import the hops, both from Bavaria, and then the yeast strain. It's a true German lager yeast strain that we use. The water is Tennessee. That's the only thing.
Yeah.
Outside of that, it's all German. But so a lot of all of our recipes are essentially based on some of these original recipes and evidence that I've dug up and researched over the years.
So as you've added, not brands, but as you've added different beers along the way, I guess you stick to those kind of those same ingredients of that same core stuff.
We
and then kind
do.
of build on
We
it?
do. So a couple of our other styles that we do is our Nashville Amber. And that's a very popular.
That's a
People
good beer.
like that amber style lager. It's got some Vienna malt in there, so technically it'd be a Vienna Amber that we do. And then our Czech Pilsner, which is a seasonal, we put out in spring, just came out for the season. That'll be out in the spring and the summer. We call it 1897 Pilsner because that Pilsner style, as I was mentioning, with that lighter malt color, that really started being prominent in the 1890s. And when Tennessee had the Centennial Exposition in 1897, Pilsner was the prominent beer served there. So that became the style and the fad to drink. And so we just named it after that from a historical aspect, 1897 Pilsner.
I think really as a guy that has dedicated his life to beer, basically, it sounds like it's really important to you to keep with the tradition of what originally got it started.
That you're absolutely right. And so we keep to those traditions, to those styles, and in every beer we do, even on our six packs, we have a little note on the side of the six pack, and even on the bottom. I don't know how many people look at the bottom of the six pack, but both the Blackstone brands and the Nashville Brewing brands, we have information about the brewery and the styles of beer on the bottom of the six packs too. We figure that's just wasted space, so why not put some information on it? But for every one of the Nashville Brewing brands that we do, we tie in the original European history of that style and how that developed, and then how that tied into Nashville. And when it was served here, when it's released, like our Bock is our traditional winter Bock that we do. So that was originally a Lenten-style beer done in Bavaria to supplement the monks' calorie intake while they were fasting. So they made a beer with a lot more malt in it. So that's what we do here with our traditional Nashville Bock. And then we also do a holiday Bock, which is that we have a little Christmas seasonings in there, holiday seasonings, cinnamon and nutmeg and other spices to spice it up.
And if I have this right, so the brewery originally, off and on, had been closed since like 1954. Is that right?
Well, so yeah. So the Gerst Brewery closed in '54, and it had been closed ever since until we relaunched Nashville Brewing Company in 2016.
So I'm really curious if you have ever met anyone who remembers coming into that brewery back in those days. Has anybody ever walked in and said, I remember way back when?
So I wrote a book called Nashville Brewing, which is just the history, everything we've just been talking about now, about the history of brewing in Nashville. And a good chunk of that book talks about Nashville Brewing and how it merged, you morphed into Gerst Brewing Company. The brewery was rebuilt in the 1890s and built into a bigger structure than the original NBC building was. But when I wrote that book, that was about 20 years ago almost, I had interviewed some people that worked in the brewery. So not people that necessarily visited, but actually worked in the brewery. And now I still get people reach out, my great-grandfather worked there, or I had a neighbor that worked there. So I do get that a lot.
What's the most unique story that you've heard from that?
So a lot of people would say they always heard there was a tunnel or tunnels under the brewery. And some of them say they would go to a speakeasy during Prohibition. And so some of those stories got tweaked a little bit and elaborated on, but there actually were big lagering cellars under the brewery and adjacent to the brewery. Across the street from the brewery was where the hop house was. And there was a tunnel that ran under the street from the brewery to the hop house. And I have documentation when they built that tunnel, and they had to get permission from the city to rip up the road to dig all that out. And this was, right around the turn of the century, 1900. There, across from that original brewery, I have a historical marker where the brewery was, but across from that is a vacant lot, and I had evidence that that's where the lagering cellars were in that area right there, and then the tunnels would run underneath the street from the lagering cellar to where the brewery was. And so a buddy of mine, I was an archaeology professor at Vanderbilt, and we were just talking one day, just sitting right here at the brewery, saying, I've got evidence, I've got maps. And he said, I have access to ground penetrating radar. We can figure that out. So we went and did that, and we actually mapped out those cellars. Unfortunately, my buddy had passed away. But yeah, so I have all that evidence, and I've worked with the city. We're talking about doing a dig down in there. It is private property, so having to work with the landowners and stuff too. But it's just fascinating. We're just kind of taking our time on that.
I saw the news story about that, and I never could find anything like post after the news story, like what you guys actually found out or what.
Yeah. So again, I do have it mapped out. A friend the archaeologist that was leading that, he did pass away, so kind of put it on hold. Metro Historical Commission is well aware of that. They're eager to do it, so it's just on hold. It's not put off by any means. And there is a lot of construction going on. They're building a couple of high rises right adjacent to that, so we're just kind of letting all the dust settle, if you will.
Yeah, and hopefully there's no risk of the private owner doing something without.
So where this is, the private owner is well aware of this.
Okay.
And yeah, so no problems there.
Good. Okay. Good. You hate for something just you show up one day and there's a skyscraper.
Exactly. But we do think that or I know now that lot, why there has never been construction there is because of the cellars. I mean, they're going to have to excavate all that. Okay. Because it's not sound just to put a structure on it the way
that makes sense. Yeah. One of the beers you were talking about, some of the beers you make, I saw one. It must have been a small batch or a one-off or something. The smoked lager,
the smoked beer, the Rush beer.
Yes, I never got to get it. What was it for? Was it a special event or something? Because
so we will do that generally once a year in the winter. So a smoked beer in German it's called a Rush beer. Rush is German for smoke. Traditionally from Bamberg, Germany, so northern Bavaria. As I mentioned before, all beer or all barley used to be malted, and it would be dried out using that smoking method. So beer was dark, beer was smoky. A couple hundred years ago, things really changed. And how beer was made and became the flavors that we know today. But Bamberg stuck to that traditional method of using smoke to dry their malt out. So the Rosh beers you will mostly find in Bamberg, Germany. It's a beautiful, beautiful medieval city. Highly recommend visiting it if you're over there. So every once in a while we like to make it. My partner Chase at the brewery, him and I both love Rosh beers. Other partner Kent, he hates them. But the general public, it's an acquired taste because they can be bold. Some are more mild than others, but some of them can be very, very strong and smoke. I personally like the strong smoky flavor. If you like a strong smoky barbecue or brisket, it pair well great with that.
Sure.
But they just in the market do not sell well. So we do a small batch. We serve it here in the tap room. Okay. For those that enjoy it, people come seek it out, and it's more so for us to enjoy ourselves.
Is there any plans on that one coming back anytime soon?
We'll probably do another one here before too long.
But I'll look for it, and I'll make sure I shoot over here and make sure I get some of it.
Definitely.
Talk about it. Well, let me tell you my experience. The last 4 or 5 years for me, lagers have, at least for me, have gotten so much better.
Yeah, I agree.
Just in general, in the craft beer. Yeah. You'd see a lager before, and your typical, your big stores or your big brands. Man, and they're so much more popular. Is it just because people are figuring out, hey, these are really good beers, and it's beer that tastes like beer kind of stuff?
Exactly. And there's kind of a couple things that come into play with this. So as microbreweries were first coming about in the craft beer industry, people saw lagers as the Bud Miller course and snubbed their nose on any craft lager because
especially if they look like that.
Exactly.
Right?
Exactly. That's just a light pale beer. I don't want to drink a Bud Miller course. I want a strong IPA or whatever it may be, a porter or a stout. And so for really the first couple of decades of the craft brewing industry, lagers got snubbed, except during Oktoberfest. All of a sudden, everyone loved an Oktoberfest Marzen style beer.
Uh-huh.
They didn't complain about it then.
I have said this, and maybe it's I'm part German on my mom's side. I'll real quick, and then I'll let you get back.
Yeah.
We found out a few years ago through like family history that on my mom's side, that my ancestors on her side came over from like Germany and France to Cincinnati in like the mid 1800s.
Yeah.
And
That's
I've always
when much of Cincinnati was settled.
Yeah, and I always loved, like Oktoberfest beers and stuff like that. So didn't mean to interrupt. I just thought I would
that's
throw them
fine.
in
So
there.
that's that amber style lager.
Yep.
Is a Marzen. I'd be happy to talk a little bit more about the history of that style.
Sure.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah.
And again, every one of our friends kind of love that kind of beer, especially when it kind of gets that time of year.
Exactly. But in general, outside of Oktoberfest, lagers were kind of snubbed. And so we started seeing just in the industry, just kind of looking at statistics, the Brewer Association stuff, that lagers were starting to make a comeback. I think people realized that, okay, lagers don't have to be that Bud Miller course. And if they're done right, they can be very good. Mm-hmm. The problem is twofold. One, lagers are generally much more expensive to make than an ale because they take longer to ferment. And so they're sitting in the tanks 3-4 times longer than what an ale is. So it's just taking up space. So to put that out, you're spending just a lot more time waiting for a lager to fully ferment and mature and be ready to package and enjoy. The second thing is lagers, and excuse my French, I don't know, you can dub this if you want to, but lagers are very easy to fuck up.
We're leaving that in, by the way.
You cannot, mask off flavors in most lagers because there's nothing there to mask it behind. It's not like an IPA or a double IPA where you can have a lot more hops in there to cover up an off flavor, or a fruited beer or something where you're just adding other adjuncts to maybe mask an off flavor. Lager yeast is very finicky, and again, it's got to be in that colder environment. It's got to stay in that colder environment. So there's a lot of things that can go wrong during just the fermenting process and then the packaging process that lagers are just more temperamental. Mm-hmm. So a lot of craft breweries that would make a lager would not turn out so great. But I think people are getting the science a little bit more and realize that you've got to take special precautions when you're doing a lager and not necessarily, not that ales are easy by any means. You can certainly mess up ales too, but they're not quite as difficult as a lager is. So if lagers are done right, and you have the time and money to invest to have them sit in the tanks longer, you can come out with some great lagers. Mm-hmm. And we're proud to do that here.
One thing I think is really funny, and I think about this often, is over the course of like how craft beer has changed, and there's certain things that I like and I don't like, and we're all that way, right?
Sure.
And I go, man, what would they have thought back in 1859? And things evolve certainly, but all of a sudden you have these breweries that are making these really weird offset beers with chocolate in them and coffee and all this other kind of stuff. Yeah. What in the world do you think they would have thought?
I think they're probably all rolling over in their grave. One of the biggest things right now that really gets me, but the Indian Pale Lager. That's just a big pet peeve of mine that people are marketing an Indian Pale Lager, and that's just taking a name and using that for marketing purposes and throwing some additional hops in a beer and calling it something different just to try and sell it.
I've seen that a few times. Yeah.
That just drives me crazy. And if you haven't been able to tell by now, I am a traditionalist.
Yes,
I am very traditional in styles. And as a brewery, both the Blackstone brands and NBC are for the most part very traditional. We do certainly there's much more experimental on the Blackstone side than NBC, but still a lot of those traditional Blackstone ales are going to be very traditional to England. The nut brown and the porter and et cetera.
In talking to people too, and Steve just mentioned this, like some of that craziness, the chocolate chip mint stout, something. It's not going away, but maybe it's settling out a little bit.
I think so. I think so.
I'll still drink some of that stuff, but you do like some traditional sometimes. This is good.
Exactly. And there's breweries that do that, and certainly make a living doing that, and that's great. But we kind of tend to focus on something different, and there's room in this industry for everyone.
Yeah, there really is.
But I feel like that's a consistent conversation because we've had, since we started this podcast a few months ago, we've had a number of people from various walks of life from breweries on, and I think everybody seems like they're starting to say that same thing, that it's only going to go so far, and then it's going to come back, and I feel like everything is like that. It's going to have a middle ground, right?
Yeah, I feel like things just started kind of going overboard there, but it's kind of the reins are being pulled in a little bit now.
People appreciating good, solid beer, good traditional beer.
Well, I want to go back a little bit. All the historical markers that are in Nashville, in the history of Nashville, and as you said, you're a traditionalist. How has that impacted just like your life in general? I mean, talk about that because it sounds like it's a real personal thing for you.
It is, and I never perceived myself as a historian at all.
But yet you are.
All of a sudden I'm wearing that hat as the beer historian, particularly here in Middle Tennessee, which I'm happy to wear. But yeah, it was a labor of love. As I mentioned, from a kid, I learned about geography from my beer cans, where the different cans were made in the United States. And as a kid, my dad was traveling internationally, and so I get cans from South Africa and all throughout Europe and South America and Asia. And so that's really how I learned geography. But really, getting into the research, I grew up north. The Civil War up there, studying that was like a couple days in history class, and we'd spent a lot more time studying World War II, World War I, and things like that. Whereas in the South, I know the Civil War history is taught a lot more in schools. And so I just really want to expose to that. So when I really started digging into learning about Nashville's brewing history, I started learning a lot more just about Nashville's history. And of course, there's a lot of history prior to Civil War II, but that was such a huge moment in the early 60s in Nashville with the Civil War. So I learned so much more. It really opened my eyes. But as far as the brewing history, I've gotten so passionate about that. Not just Nashville's brewing history, but how styles developed, for the most part in Europe, but how they developed and became the beers that we know and love today, those styles. I'm just passionate about it.
So who else are you working with? I know you've got the historical markers here in Nashville. Are there other things that you're working with the city of Nashville on to maintain this history and make sure that people really have a fundamental understanding of it?
So I have a few different things. So, first, the markers. That was working with the National Metro Historical Commission. It just through my day job with an accounting firm, and we do some stuff as a firm with Historic Nashville and the Historical Commission, and I was actually on the board of Historic Nashville for a while as their treasurer. So, I had some relationships. But the first marker came about because where that original brewery was, where NBC Gerst Brewery was, it got torn down shortly after the brewery closed in '54. And my wife just said, "Why isn't there anything there?" And I said, "I don't know." And she goes, my wife's a Nashville native. She goes, everything they do in the city, they just tear down and build something new. And she goes, "There should be a marker there." And I said, "Yeah, that'd be cool." And she goes, "Well, do something about it." And I thought, well, okay. So I started doing my research.
Challenge accepted.
Yeah, and reaching out to some of the contacts I had with Metro and figured out what channels I needed to go through and submitted it. And there's a committee with the Nashville Metro that approves that kind of thing. And you got to submit a lot of documentation. You can't anyone can't throw up a marker because they said, "Oh, something cool probably happened here," or whatever. You got to do all the research.
And is it you doing it all too? Like they don't do anything for you?
Yeah. Like they do some fact checking and stuff, but I have to provide all the support too for that. And I had done a lot of that already with the book. I had a lot of the information. So when it came out to put in that first marker there at the Nashville Brewing Company, I got a notice that it was approved. And so this was cool. And I'm like, well, that's fantastic. So when will it go in? They said, well, we'll order it. It takes about 6 to 8 weeks for it to be made, and it's all cast iron and all that. I'm like, fantastic. And they said, how do you want to pay for it? And I said, what do you mean? And they said, well, these cost money. And I said, well, yeah, don't our tax dollars pay for that?
Yeah, you're the government,
Yeah,
right?
yeah. They say,
Hello?
oh, no. And I'm like, well, what about all these, the Civil War battle happened here and such happened there. And they're so that's the Daughters of the Confederates raise money, do all that kind of stuff. And I said, oh, all right. I said, well, how much is it? And I was thinking $300-400. And first one I think was $2,700. And I said, oh, all right, well, let me think a minute.
Yeah.
So I talked to my wife, and she's like, you've already gone this far and invested. You might as well do it. And so I agreed and went ahead and did that. And so I had that first marker put in, and that was like 10 years ago. And
What was that first one, by the way?
It was the Nashville Brewing one, where the Nashville Brewing in the Gerst brewery stood.
That's
so
right.
where that original brewery was. So that was the first one. And then the next one, I think in 2008. So that was like the only one I did. That was my contribution. Still researching history and all that, but didn't really see a need to have any other markers at that point. And so after that, in 2018, the Craft Brewers Conference, which is the large Brewers Association conference, huge industry conference, was going to be at Nashville in 2018. And an article came out, it's either in the Post or the Tennessean or something, about does Nashville have a brewing district? And so they reached out to interview me. Is there a current brewing district? And I was like, well, we got various areas, just like we were talking about offline. You got different areas of town that have concentration of breweries. And they're like, but from a historical standpoint, where that Nashville Brewing Company actually was that the brewing district? I said, well, no, there's one brewery there. It wasn't a district. I said, really, Germantown was a district. They were smaller breweries, but you had 4 breweries there operating simultaneously within a few blocks from each other. And so then they wanted more information. Then the Craft Brewers Conference, part of their magazine, as leading up to this conference, they wanted more information. So they had reached out to me. So I thought, all right, I got to get all my facts straight. So I had various research. So I put it all together, did a paper providing the information, the owners of these other 4 breweries that are operating. This was in the 1860s. They're operating simultaneously, as well as Nashville Brewing Companies. There were 7 breweries actually operating simultaneously in the 1860s. By 1872, they all had closed besides Nashville Brewing Company. That was the only one that survived. But those 4 in Germantown, after I did that research, I'm like, well, hell, there should probably be another marker signifying these 4. So that's I had that one put in, and that got approved, and now I have 7 historical markers.
Have you tried along the way, or maybe you've done it? Have you, rallied some people to help, build funds to do it, or did you just pay for every one of them yourself?
I paid for all of them myself. That first one, I had a couple of people offer to put in some money, but outside of that, that's just been my contribution to the city.
Yeah. That's amazing.
Yeah. It's some of the other stuff you're asking about, working with the city and other things. So I am working with the Tennessee State Archives and the State Museum. I have a lot of historical pieces, advertising pieces, mostly Gerst, pre-Prohibition, beautiful. These are works of art. Back then, you didn't have tin tackers and neon signs. They were pieces of art that would hang in saloons. And so I have a lot of these. They're highly collectible, and a lot of breweries put them out. Cincinnati had a lot of them.
Sure.
But for the beer historians, these are very collectible. And so I've amassed a number of these, and my wife and I don't have kids, so trying to figure out what now are we going to do with these. So we're working with the State Museum to have a permanent display. I was thinking at one point doing a museum myself, but the way Nashville, cost of land and all that stuff is, it's really wouldn't be feasible to, because I do have a nonprofit related to brewing history, but to fund that, to have this last over long after I'm gone, it's probably not going to happen. So working with the museum, of course, they want their donation too, in order to have that be a permanent display. So we're working on that. So
I feel like you might be a little biased when I ask this question, whatever answer you give.
Sure.
But when you look at cities across the country that have the deep, rich history of beer, where do you think Nashville ranks?
I would like to say we're getting there.
Yeah.
A lot of cities have that history. It's just there's not someone there to dig that history up and alert people. And so, like Cincinnati is phenomenal. They have a historical brewery trail that they have. You can tour all the cellars there in the over the Rhine area. Phenomenal. They have it together. They have a large nonprofit organization that handles all this. Most cities don't. And so that's one thing that I am trying to do in Nashville and build awareness, because we do have a great brewing history. And like I said, a lot of cities do, just, there's not people out there to bring that up to everyone's interest.
Was it tough? Do you think it's tough because there was a dead period here? Kind of, when they, like, you obviously had brought it back, but is it tough to kind of find all the history, or to Steve's point, like, hey, how do we rank because there was a dead period?
Yeah, it was very difficult finding information. Spent a lot of time in the archives. This was before there's a lot of stuff on the internet too. Things are a little bit easier to research now. But 20 years ago, when I first researching that book, it's hard to find information.
I feel like you may. I remember back, and they may still have it. It's been a long time, but if you maybe went to the Nashville Library. And did you ever do that? Go into like the archives of the newspapers?
That's exactly what I did.
Way back when. Yeah, you did that?
Yep. Yeah, I can't tell you how many newspapers I've read from the 1800s.
Yeah. Can you talk about some of the stuff that you found in them?
Yeah, I was looking specifically for beer stuff. But again, finding out styles that were being brewed, who was brewing them, where they were getting grain from, hiring staff, just all that stuff that would be in a paper beer. I've got some wonderful Nashville Brewing advertising for Bach beer that they were making back then. In fact, I know the listeners won't be able to see it, but that Bach beer sign that's on the wall way up there, it's got a goat, and just about every Bach beer advertising in the world is going to have a goat associated with it. So we had that in Nashville too, and there's a reason for that. And I'll be happy to dive into that if you guys want to know about the goat. So goat is loosely translated as Bach, but there's some other reasoning behind that. But in Bavaria, we talked about these lagers being made there, and Bach was that style of beer, is a stronger beer, and the monks were making that stronger beer because they had more grain to supplement their calorie intake while they were fasting. Well, up in northern Germany, a town called Einbeck, they were making a stronger beer to basically transport in the North Sea. So they were exporting some beer, but you had to make it stronger in order for the beer to survive. Because the only way to preserve beer is either refrigeration, higher alcohol, or hops. And hops got added to beer about 1,000 years ago as a preservative. But those are the main three things to preserve beer. So they were brewing a stronger beer. The monks ended up bringing someone down from Einbeck to teach them how to brew this stronger style of beer. And so they say that Einbeck got loosely translated as Bach. The beer from Einbeck, the beer from Beck became Bach, that style. But also it's a goat. The goat was the hardy alpine animal of Bavaria, and it's the hardy strong beer. So it just traditionally, that goat got put on every advertising for Bach beer to this day. Okay. So it's fun finding that kind of stuff in the 1800s that Nashville was, had that goat too.
You said before we started recording that we were talking about your book, and you said obviously that's been 20 years, and you found a bunch of stuff kind of since then.
Oh, yeah.
What are some other things you can talk about you've come across, and when you're actively looking for it, even after you wrote the book?
Sometimes some are happy accidents. Other times it's I'm digging and stuff, and there's just more information available than there was 20 years ago. The internet has been great. Newspapers.com, is wonderful because you can just find stuff. Finding out a lot more about, beer being distributed outside of Nashville, particularly when we get in the early 1900s. Gerst started pushing beer out, going to Jackson and East Tennessee, and even in Louisville for a period of time, and down in Alabama. So that kind of stuff, I really didn't have that documentation for earlier. I knew they were doing a little bit, but didn't know how much they were doing.
This concludes part 1 of our episode with Scott Mertie of Nashville Brewing. Part 2 will be coming up soon. For Scott Turon, I'm Steve Sullivan, and this has been the Brewery Underground Podcast.